Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Sprung, National Executive Director of the Producers Guild. I hope some of you were able to tune in to last night's panel with the nominees for Outstanding Producer of Documentary Motion Picture. It was a fascinating conversation. In case you missed it, it's now available on the PGA's YouTube channel. Tonight, we're excited to bring you a panel with some of the incredibly talented producers who've been nominated for Outstanding Producer of Nonfiction Television. Leading tonight's conversation, I'm pleased to introduce the amazing Jonathan Murray, who is a member of the PGA Board of Representatives. Jonathan made his career in nonfiction programming, first creating and producing MTV's The Real World, and later expanding to producing documentaries like Autism, the Musical, and Transhood. Thanks for being here, John. Take it away.
Thank you, Susan. I'm honored today to get to talk to the representatives of the producing teams of the 5 nominated PGA nonfiction programs. The diversity of these projects and the quality of these projects are great examples of the extraordinary work being done in nonfiction storytelling. Our panelists, all multiple award-winning producers, are Eve Kay, representing the producing team of Stanley Tucci, Searching for Italy, Bill Owens, representing the producing team of 60 Minutes, David Collins, representing the producing team of Queer Eye, Peter Jackson, representing the producing team of the Beatles, Get Back, and Amy Ziering, representing the producing team of Owens versus Farrow. I'm going to spend about 12 minutes talking with each nominee, and then after everyone has spoken, I'll hit them up with one final question where we'll bring them all back together. I'm going to start with Amy Ziering and her project, Owens versus Farrow. Owens versus Farrow is a 4-part series documenting the accusation of sexual abuse against Woody Allen by Dylan, his then 7-year-old daughter with Mia Farrow. Amy, you have told some very powerful stories of sexual abuse in your documentaries, The Invisible War, The Hunting Ground, and On the Record. What made you want to tell this story?
That's an interesting question. It was completely by accident. I was actually working on something else, inadvertently had a meeting set up with Dylan, and did an interview with her on camera for that other project. And in the course of that interview, I was like, wait, what? I'm of the age where, I grew up with Woody Allen films, and I was very much, in my 20s in the 90s. So I followed this story, but I only followed it from what I'd heard in the media. And everything Dylan was saying just didn't track with everything I believed and was led to believe for the last 30 years, mostly by the media and the media's interpretation of events, and also the publicity, the way it had been spun out in the publicity field in Hollywood as well. And so I called up Kirby Dick, my co-directing partner, and Amy Hurdy, our investigative producer. And I said, wait, Dylan said all these things. What do you think? And then we just all sort of started talking about it and percolating, and reached out to Dylan. And she said, yeah, well, I have all these my mom has all these home movies, and I'm happy to, share with you the documentation. And so Amy Hurdy just started diving in and investigating. And that's kind of how it happened. It happened very organically. We're a little unique in that way, is that we're kind of original investigative reporters. And I like to say the films find us, we don't find them. So that's how this came about.
And how long was the research period, and what gave you the confidence to commit to telling this story, to actually start rolling cameras?
It was extensive. I think the whole project took us a full 4 years. 2 of that was research. The confidence came from the incredible amount of evidence we amassed. And that was corroborated through and through. And that's what, we're not going to go out and say anything, that we couldn't stand by and wouldn't have the integrity of the truth. And so it was everything. Amy Hurdy kept digging up, and then we would talk to people and we'd find corroboration. We spoke to eyewitnesses that had never been spoken to before. We reviewed the testimony. Mia had these conversations that had been recorded between her and Woody, which were pretty damning and incriminating and revelatory, that no one in public had ever heard. We watched the original tape itself that Dylan had been in possession of since it had been recorded by Mia, where it was Dylan's first account. And we then had experts. We then had experts look at it, numerous, and give us their opinion, like, could a kid be coached? What is the evidence? And it was just incontrovertible, person after person was like, oh my God, no, this is textbook. Actually, this is exactly how a child speaks if in fact they have been sexually assaulted. So it was all those things together that gave us the confidence.
Yeah. How did you, going into this, figure out the sort of the tone that you wanted for this?
Well, the tone, again, as I said, our films find us organically, and the tone really got set when we saw this trove of videotapes that Mia Farrow had taped for decades. I had no idea going into this, nor did Kirby or Amy, that she's an amateur cineast, and this was pre-cell phones and pre-video cameras when all of us, like right now, that's not a big deal to say about someone, but she was filming with cameras. I mean, who does that? As she was an actress and she had access. And so she had these home movies were absolutely incredible. And we didn't know that. And then she, decided to trust us and actually let us see it. It was this whole process. And then we said, well, if we use discrete portions, we'd be okay with it, et cetera, et cetera. So once we saw those, and then once I visited her house in Connecticut, and it was like, it spoke to us. It was like, oh, this could really be, the house is like a character itself. And I don't know, our Thor Tilo, our incredible cinematographer, shot it like a character. Those two things, when I looked at the footage that I got with Tor, and then when we looked at the footage of the tapes, we were like, we got how to, we could set this in that tone and spirit. And also because obviously so much happened in that house, and it is the story of a nuclear family. So it was through those pieces, but it was not from the outset. All of our stuff always comes after the fact. We make as we go. The other unique thing I think we do also is we shoot and edit, shoot and edit, shoot and edit. There's no development, there's no pre-production. And we've just always done that. That's kind of how we grew up. And I know that's kind of weird having now seen how other people work, but so that's how it gets crafted and how the tone gets shaped. It's as we go.
Well, and your story also was evolving as you were taping. So you were constantly having to go out and get more of the story, I think.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, the social worker, we were Amy Hurdy was doggedly chasing people, but we never knew we'd get that interview or not. In fact, most of it was shot pre-COVID, but then suddenly people appeared in COVID. That social worker was one of them. And I remember I was so frustrated because it was the height of COVID and I really wanted to do it in person. She was really important. And she'd never been, even sought out by any reporters. And here she was going to talk with us on camera. And if anyone hasn't seen it and watch it, I mean, I know in the third episode, I mean, people still write to me about how blown away they are by her testimony. I mean, she actually ended up not doing social work because she was so outraged by what happened with this case. She said, how can I work trying to help kids when it's rich people that get away with this stuff? And it's kind of really harrowing. But anyways, yes, to your point is, again, it's organic because we don't know what interviews we're going to get or not. And the last thing I'll say, the crazy thing is there were 3 nannies in the house that day. And Amy Hurdy could not find the third nanny. We could find and talk to the other 2. And we wanted to for due diligence and also to see if they do an interview. And I'm blanking on her name. It's a very kind of common name. And she searched everywhere and she felt so defeated. Amy Hurdy's like incredible. And she was like, and then the day we're locking pictures, she calls up and she says, she's here. She'll do an interview. And we're like, what? And she says, yes, I had this crazy idea to just snail mail. And I wrote to I'm just going to say Victoria Jackson. That's not her name. I'm blanking because I'm old, but I wrote to every Victoria Jackson in the phone book, in England. I did it because maybe she's not online. Maybe she's just old school. And I get a return to my mail. She calls me and says, yeah, I'm that person and I'll speak. So anyways, we ended up interviewing. We couldn't put her in the series, but we put her in the podcast. And it was incredible. And Ronan and Mia were like, and Dylan were like, I cannot believe you found her and reached her. But so yes, it is very spontaneous and of the moment.
And how much of a challenge did Woody Allen refusing to participate in telling his side of the story create for you? And you sort of came up with some pretty good workarounds.
Well, yeah, I mean, we kind of anticipated that he wouldn't speak with us. We were hoping, but the gift was that he wrote a book and he recorded it in his own words, and it's his account of everything that happened, and we could fair use that. So it pretty much is what he would say. And we got to be able to sort of present his side in his own voice. So that was a gift, you know, and really wonderful. So it was a wonderful workaround. And, you know, and again, as I've said in every interview, there's a total standing offer. I'm extremely happy to sit down with him anytime, anywhere, if he wants to follow up or clarify anything or say anything different. But we haven't heard from him, and we haven't heard one fact retraction requested by any legal teams.
How much did your responsibility to telling Dylan's story weigh on you throughout this? And were you able to keep her trust through the whole process?
That's a great question. It was more, what weighs on me with anything I do is the responsibility to the integrity and truth of the issue and everyone who's afflicted by that issue. So it's not just your characters per se, but, you know, I deal with sort of big social issues. But in this case, it was like every incest survivor. Like, I have to do this so that every incest survivor feels safe, protected, and feels their story's been honored. You know, it's not just Dylan and Mia, it's much bigger. So it's that weight, and it's huge, you know, and I don't, you know, I have secondary PTSD from doing this work. Didn't know I'd get that, but it's a different kind of lift, and it's a different kind of responsibility. And I feel it in every frame, honestly, of every work we've ever done.
Great. Well, thank you for making this. Later, I'm going to come back to you and ask you about the larger impact you hope that the documentary will have. Next is Peter Jackson, representing the producing team of The Beatles Get Back. Get Back is a 3-part documentary that uses footage from an aborted Beatles film project to chronicle a critical period in the band's history. Peter, at some point in the documentary, Paul McCartney is worried that what they are recording is just a film about making a record, but it was so much more than that, wasn't it?
It was an evolving story, really. You know, and Michael Lindsay Hogg shot the original footage in 1969, and the idea was that it was going to be a concert. I mean, I think that the primary driving force behind the whole project was that the Beatles wanted to play live again, which they hadn't done since Candlestick Park in 1966. So that's, you know, getting on for two and a half years. And they just a few months earlier, they'd done the promo film for their new single at the time, Hey Jude, where they actually had 200 Beatle fans coming in and surrounding them as they were playing Hey Jude, and it was filmed for the David Frost TV show. And that was the first time they had performed to an audience for 2 years. And so they decided that they would do a live concert again in a similar format, where they'd have 200 or 300 people. And then they were intending originally to record White Album songs, so to perform, because the White Album had just come out in November 1968. The White Album was out. So in January 1969, it's still the number one album in the charts. And the intention originally was that they would do a live concert with I guess with 12 or 14 songs from the White Album. But then, of course, the Beatles being the Beatles, they decided that wasn't really good enough. They should always move forward. And so they decided to write 14 new songs. And so they'd be performing new songs. And then they decided that it wasn't just going to be a concert for those 200 or 300 people. It would also be broadcast as a TV special. So it would screen on TV a day or two after it was filmed. And then they decided that they should film their rehearsals for the live show, because that could form a little preamble to the TV show. So there'd be like a 30-minute film of showing them rehearsing that would culminate in the hour-long TV show. So that was the original plan, and Michael Lindsay Hogg was brought into with a couple of 16mm film crews to shoot the rehearsals. But, you know, if I won't go into the whole journey of it, but of course it ends up very, very different to that. It gets, the whole idea of the live concert gets abandoned halfway through. The TV special gets thrown out the door. They retreat. They go from Twickenham Studios, where they were for the first half, which is really a rehearsal space where the concert was ultimately going to be filmed. They then go back into their tiny little basement studio in Savile Row, and they decided just to record the songs. So they're pleased with the songs that they've worked up during those first few days, and they're now not going to do the show. They're just going to record them. But you're right. Paul McCartney was always traditionally the Beatles, he always wanted more than just recording an album. He wanted, he wanted he was interested in films. He was interested in the Beatles doing something different that other people hadn't done before. And so very much the whole project is really driven by the internal tension within the group about what is this going to be, and who's on board with it and who's not.
How do you, when you're handed this incredible treasure trove, I mean, beautifully shot footage, how did you figure out how you wanted to tell the story? Because you ultimately told it very simply.
Well, that was the first question that Apple Corps, the Beatles company, asked me is what's the story? What's the story? When they asked if I wanted to be involved, and they said, what's the story going to be? And I said, well, just give me a few weeks to look at the footage. I mean, the footage is there's 60 hours of footage, but the truth of it is the spine of it is the audio. The Nagra sound recordist was recording virtually the whole time. There was 2 Nagra tape machines. And apart from having to change the tape reels every 16 minutes, you pretty much got to continue recording. You got about 150 hours of audio, which is really the spine of it. And the cameras were just turning on and off, on and off, on and off all the way through. So we had to listen to this 150 hours, of which some of it had picture and a lot of it didn't. And even just looking at that or playing it, if you do 10 hours a day, it's about 3 weeks worth of work just to get through it. And so I didn't know what the story was until I was able to sit back and watch all the material. And then when you get to the end, you realize that there's all this stuff that you've heard that didn't have a context, but it does now. So we go back and we hear it all over again, because you've got to figure out all those conversations early on that didn't really mean much on the first go through, because you've now got to the end and you see where it all ended up. There's things that were said earlier that actually are important. So it was shuttling backwards and forwards. And fortunately, Jabez, my editor, and I were able to do that quite. We had time to do that because we had to restore all the footage. And so while this footage was being restored, the entire the sound and the audio for the whole project, not just the finished cut, but the entire rushes, we were restoring those before we even got started. While that was happening, we were able to immerse ourselves, and the story emerged from the historical facts of the time. I mean, it's a story of a month in the life of the Beatles on a particular project, and so we ultimately just decided that the footage and the audio tells its own story. And so I didn't really want it to be. I didn't want a modern context where people in 2022 are looking back and remembering 52 years ago. And their memories are not always accurate, or they sometimes just can't remember. I thought it was much more important to be going through this day-by-day story at the time, as almost like going back in a time machine and sitting there and just watching it unfold. So it's a little bit like a slow motion train wreck that kind of ends up being this recovery process, and it ends up okay in the end.
Yeah, and as a viewer, it allowed me to be right there in the room, because you didn't put in interviews, you didn't put things in front of me to keep me from being in that room. And I loved your use of the camera cards to fill in the gaps.
Well, at the very beginning of it, I was trying to work out early on, when I was first looking at the footage, I was trying to figure out what the plan was going in, because obviously what they end up with is not what, as I said, it's not what they intended when on the first day. So I was really curious as to what exactly was this plan, because the books don't, all the Beatle books don't really have an accurate account. So I thought, well, this is Paul drove this project. He got them all to assemble in Twickenham on the 2nd of January. So I thought, well, the one person I can ask is Paul. So I asked Paul McCartney what was, I said, forget where it actually went, just what was on the very first day, what was your intention, what was your plan? And he looked at me and he said, I have no idea. so that should have showed me that it's probably not a good idea to have modern day interviews. Not the best idea. We'd be much better off just to stick with the footage from that period.
You also had Paul, Ringo, Yoko, and Olivia Harrison on board as producers. You had to establish trust with them. Obviously, you're telling their story. How did that work out? How did you maintain that trust? Any dicey moments along the way to the finished product?
Not really. I mean, it's interesting because in their minds, especially Ringo and Paul and George was famously had a very bitter memory of this period as well. And John actually did too. Their memories are more associated with the breaking up of the group when the movie Let It Be, which was made. So it wasn't really an aborted project because it did end up. The footage did end up being used in a film in 1970, May 1970, called Let It Be, that Michael directed. That was released at the same time as the Beatles broke up. So, and that was about 14 months after the footage was actually shot. So our story tells obviously the story of the time that the footage was being shot in January 69, and yet the movie that was produced from the footage back in 1970 happened to, unfortunately, and it's a shame for Michael that it came out right at the point that the Beatles split up. So so I realized that even the Beatles themselves associate this entire Get Back project with the breaking up of the band. They've just come over the passing of time, and as the decades have gone on, they've come to symbolize the breaking up of the band, which is not true at all. I mean, it's just not true. In fact, I'd say that the footage that I saw showed a band that was trying to actually continue being a band. It wasn't a band that was on the cusp of breaking up or in the process of breaking up. It was a band that was trying to stay together, is what is actually seen in the footage. And to be honest, Ringo and Paul had completely forgotten that. They literally couldn't remember January 1969, but they could remember May 1970 when Let It Be came out, because it was a hellishly upsetting time for them. And they remembered that just fine as a very upsetting time, but they didn't have any real memory of the period it was shot. So it was a bit dicey in having to convince them that the footage doesn't show awful things, which they imagined it did. And I think once I told them that and I showed them a few bits, I went to Ringo's house with an iPad and showed him some footage, met up with Paul, met up with Olivia, sent Sean clips and things. Once they realized what was actually in the footage, they said, okay, great, let's do it, and they gave me final cut, and when the film was finished, I sent it to them, and I was expecting comments saying, "Oh, could you please cut this?" Or the bit where I say that, could you cut that? Or don't show me doing this. But I didn't get a single note. I didn't get a single note. In fact, one of them said when they saw the finished cut, they said it was one of the most stressful things that they'd ever seen in their life. But please don't change a thing. Don't. So the word I got back, which was completely the opposite to what I was expecting, was don't change a thing. It's fine. So they had accepted the fact that it's become historical now, that this footage is historical. It's not tied in with their egos or the dynamics between the band members, which at the time was incredibly potent. Obviously, as you could imagine, being human beings with a band splitting up, as was in 1970, I think they've come to realize that so much time has gone by now that then it's not about their individual image or how they look. It's about the fact that it's very, very, very historical. So they were actually brave. I think that the Beatles were quite brave in allowing a lot of this to come out, because there's some pretty raw stuff in there. So,
well, thank you, Peter. I'll be back with a final question for you at the end of this panel, about maybe what this film contributes to what we know about the history of this band and about how music is made. But I'll let you think about that while I talk to David Collins. He's the executive producer and creator of Queer Eye, and he's representing his producing team. Queer Eye features a team of experts from the LGBTQ community who help individuals achieve a happier and more satisfied life. David, how is today's Queer Eye different from the Queer Eye from, I don't know, was it 15 years ago?
17 years ago, almost 18, yeah, 2000.
Back when you had hair.
Well, back when I had a little bit of hair, not much,
Yeah.
a little bit. What was different about it was the time, right? Back in 2004, I wasn't saying, here's my husband, or this is my boyfriend. It was a different time, right? So the Fab Five were more like superheroes that kind of flew into the moment, saved the day, and flew out. And we didn't really know who they were. They were behind their disguise. And that obviously served its purpose at the time, back in 2004. That's what America, the world, it was one of the largest international selling formats at the time. It was all the world could really probably digest at the time. Flash forward 17 years, and the new Fab Five are a lot more comfortable sharing about the fact that they're married or divorced or have kids or whatever in their personal lives. So that juxtaposition between the original Fab Five that truly carried the weight, right? They broke through. They were the ones that had to put themselves out there, and a couple of them weren't even out yet when we first cast them. So it was a big deal between 2004 and 2022 when our Fab Five now get to, and why the show, I think, the series continues to go is because they were able to be very vulnerable and show their personal side, what their personal home lives are actually like, which makes you connect even more to them.
It really does. What makes a great Queer Eye story? Because, these episodes, they totally rely on that casting of that person who's going to be helped. And, that story has to work.
Yeah, the casting's everything. I mean, we can start there. It just truly is. Again, back in the early days, you need a new couch, your apartment's a little disheveled. We're going to come in and transform that. No longer, and honestly, even back then, that was the beginning. But it's about the layers, right? In this season, we have Angel gets her wings. It's a trans woman whose story is not just about a trans story, but or her transformation, but more importantly, it's about a reunion with her father. It's about the layers that come through a disconnect and a reconnect, this storytelling that evolves. There's so many great episodes in this past season, but each of them, we call them our heroes. Those heroes are truly sharing their stories and letting you behind the curtain and seeing their challenges in their own personal lives and how the focus of these 5 gay men and putting them in the spotlight, loving on them and sharing with them and giving them validation for who they are. The old confidence breeds success is a big part of how the series continues to grow with what makes an actual great Queer Eye episode.
Yeah, and I noticed that was pretty consistent through the episodes. For instance, Josh, the rancher, he had that girlfriend who he had sort of broken up with and maybe cheated on, but never really explained stuff. So there always seems to be someone, Terry, the dance instructor, her daughter, that relationship. So you usually have a relationship that's going to be helped healed.
Yeah, it's layers of healing, correct. Josh actually for me is kind of like the quintessential episode, right? He's just the straight guy who lets them in, embraces the fact that he's going on this journey for 5 days. And that's kind of the cool part about this series as well, the format is that it's real time, right? The guys actually come into their lives and spend a full week with them and celebrating them and take them on different adventures. And it's through those adventures that the layers of the onion get peeled back and we see the connections start to happen. And that's why the tears come, right? We laugh, we cry along the way. Our filter, if you will, that we always use, transformation through information told with comedy that has heart. And that's kind of what we do. We use that lens for all the stories. Is there a transformation story to be told? And as we tell it, hopefully you're going to laugh and maybe cry a little along the way.
Yeah, I love the mix of humor, emotion. It's great. It keeps it from being earnest because there's always that humor there. Is it sometimes hard to keep a subject's trust because you're taking them on this journey, and a journey where you're getting them out from past behaviors can be scary? So do you sometimes have that moment where someone's not sure they can do it?
Sure. I think what's so great though about our cast is that they do earn the trust of the hero. They come in that first day, and while they're a bull in a china shop, the reality is they're sitting down and they are having one-on-one quiet time with each of the heroes and sharing, again, back to that first question, sharing about themselves. Because I think each of the Fab Five, whether it's Bobby or Anthony or Karamo or Jonathan, the more they share about themselves and they're vulnerable, the more the hero opens up and the more the trust happens. And again, all of us on this panel, we all have teams, right? We have amazing partners that come in there, and our producers and storytellers are so hyper aware of how sensitive each of these individual heroes' stories are.
You've sort of opened up the show in a way by you've added a house that the guys have sort of as their command post, and we see little bits of them there. Maybe that goes back to your idea of letting us get to know them a little better.
It is. The loft, if you will, it is the Fab Five headquarters. It's where all their tools of their trade exist, and they come in and out. There's a mythology to the show that's existed since the creation back in 2003 that we'd love to continue and to keep, which is these are five best buddies. They are indeed best buds. And that house in Texas this season was the first time that we weren't in a loft or something, but in a really cool house. So the loft itself is a fun part of our storytelling. The mythology of Queer Eye itself, I think, is an important part of the storytelling that we do.
You've also really put some great music in the show this year. Sort of a mix of the sort of inspired by being in Texas, maybe. And then you've added those fun sequences with the guys that are add a lot of production value to the show.
Who doesn't like to see five gays dancing around to some go beat? I mean, come on, it's a good time. But no, we had a lot of fun. The production value and keeping it premium is always at the forefront of what we're doing, right? We love pushing and challenging ourselves each season, and we're so grateful to get to go from city to city, from Atlanta to Kansas City to Austin, and everywhere in between.
That's great. Well, I'm going to be back to you a little later to ask you about the show and what kind of impact it's still having in this crazy world of ours. Next is Bill Owens, representing the producing team of 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes chronicles our times, telling stories from breaking news to investigative reporting to features that help us understand our world. Bill, each year is unique for you. Last year was COVID, but still the 60 Minutes clock ticked on. How did your team get through it?
Well, I think I'd like to start by saying it's really an honor to be here with everybody. I think Peter should recuse himself because one of our best stories this year was our story about Let It Be, and his work was so good. I'm such a personal fan of. That's just a small joke, Peter. Thank you again for allowing us to do that story. COVID, well, I'm not sure it was different for 60 Minutes and for anybody here. Everybody needed to figure out how to first technically work it out. We've got amazing editors and engineers who were helpful. And 60 Minutes was made out of people's kitchens, really. We were sharing things over the cloud. I wanted to make sure that we didn't lose the sharpness. We really try to apply, this the cinematic lens to what we do. Our camera people are great. Our audio folks are great. We've got, a fairly famous sound mixer, and that was difficult to wrangle and make sure that it always looked like pre-pandemic 60 Minutes. But I think we did it. And it's nice now that we're able to come back into the office. We're back in our studio. So it's a little bit easier on our production staff. And I hope it continues to move in that direction. Just the work is hard enough. We need to give those folks a break.
Well, one of the stories you did that Scott Pelley headed up this year was a two-part one called Targeting Americans. Tell me about it.
So yeah, it's actually the first report we did on this was about 2.5 years ago. And it was how national security officials in Asia and Latin America were reporting really severe side effects. At least at first, that's what they were being treated as. Nobody could put their finger on it, but it was everything from vertigo to severe headaches, loss of vision, but they were very targeted, and everybody had a very similar story, whether they were in mainland China or Havana, for example, that they usually in the middle of the night, usually in their home, they would feel kind of this directed wave that would hit them in their heads. And in many cases, it was also, their families were being targeted. At least that was what they were reporting to their bosses. It wasn't, I would say it wasn't handled particularly well by the US government. All of these places are tricky diplomatically. So you're raising this seemingly far-fetched, almost sci-fi sounding attack on people. Why? But all of the reporting from these people in these different places was so similar, and their voices, they were angry that they weren't being treated, especially some of their children. They were being ignored. Little kids were falling down after, days after waking up in the middle of the night screaming, and their mothers or fathers running into their bedrooms and pulling them out of their bed. One guy put his head down on his kid's pillow and was like, oh my God. So they weren't listened to. Okay, so that was our story 2 years ago. And frankly, we were derided. A lot of people within the government were like, you're believing these hypochondriacs. I think it was, I don't want to say who it was, but one of the major newspapers wrote a piece that was like, wow, 60 Minutes fell for this. Okay. Fast forward, same reporting team, Oriana Zill and Michael Ray, who work with Scott Pelley, for over a year, have been gathering string on this because of the people they originally reported on, and those people, they gained their confidence. It's the sort of thing Amy was speaking about earlier. They believed them, they stood up for them, they listened to their stories, they told them wholly. And so they would turn us over to another person, this person in Belgium, this person in London. And this year, it was Washington, D.C. It's on the grounds of the White House. And everybody's telling the same story. So I'll finish up here. This story, the CIA, for example, and the State Department had to start taking it seriously. And the CIA director sat down with us. Not to say that he knows what's happening, but to say that these people are actually injured and they need the government's help in their health care.
Wow. I mean, that's the great thing about a 60 Minutes story. It usually has an impact. I mean, when it's on 60 Minutes, government officials, business leaders, they have to recognize that they have to respond.
Yeah, well, we hope that that's the case, especially when someone's been wronged. I mean, look, we're not just recently, for years, politicians have tried to use us. We do a report, or a group, or whomever. We do a report that people they don't like. It's not their side of the story per se. And, you become a punching bag. That happens, but that sort of comes with the territory. It is, to your point, Jonathan, it is, I'm always happy when we can be a part of, and it's not because of us, but when we can be a part of some solution or someone getting the attention they deserve, and hopefully some help. And that can be around, we did stories this year when the huge tornadoes ripped through Kentucky and Appalachia. And, some of those families that we talked about, GoFundMe pages were set up, but those families were like, well, this isn't for us, this is for our community. And, that's a small way of us lending a hand sort of locally to a tragedy. In the other cases, something like the Havana syndrome story that we did, hopefully it's a bigger conversation the government has to get involved in.
You also get to tell some really beautiful feature stories. I think one of my favorites this season was the story about Tony Bennett, titled The Final Act, reported by Anderson Cooper. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I agree with you. That was a very difficult story. And interestingly, it wasn't difficult because Tony Bennett's family wanted to be very careful about Tony. Of course they were, and we wanted to be very careful about that. And that's why we also spoke with his doctor beforehand to make sure that we would handle this the right way and appropriately. And, this wasn't about ever showing something sad, but the Bennett family really, really wanted to do this for other families who are dealing with friends, family members, fathers, mothers, dealing with Alzheimer's. Lady Gaga, who Anderson has done before, who's profiled before for 60 Minutes, who's one of the most amazing entertainers of our generation. She's a busy woman. And she also is an entertainer who is trying to make sure that her Lady Gaga and everything that she does is up to her standards. Like Tony Bennett in his prime, these entertainers and Paul McCartney and Woody Allen and so many others, they have a lot of control. So it was difficult. We had lots of shoots that were scheduled that got put off, and performances and practices, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really challenging. I'll tell you that the producer of the story it was like her last gasp when we got the final element. She was ready to throw in the towel a number of times. And she's relentless and tough, et cetera, but she just didn't think it was going to get done. And then, as we all know, right, you make your own luck, you hang in there long enough, and the gods smile upon you. And she was just amazing.
And you were building to this whole idea of when Tony would walk out on stage with Lady Gaga, would he be able to remember the words? Would there be something that would click?
Yeah.
And no one knew whether.
No.
I mean, and that was,
We had a feeling when Anderson went to Tony's apartment for that practice that he did with his longtime pianist, and the guy starts playing and Tony starts singing, classics from the 40s immediately, word for word, without a note in front of him. I remember Anderson calling me afterwards and saying, "You're not going to believe this. It was unbelievable." They had spent a lot of time with Tony. He had good periods and periods where he wouldn't quite remember who Anderson was. But when the music started there in his home during the practice, it was very clear. Speaking with the doctor, that was also something that she was fairly certain of, that part of the brain in Alzheimer's patients, many of us have had to deal with it with family members or friends. They are very good at recalling things from their 20s or teens, or maybe even when you were young. And today and yesterday is very foggy. So, but for it to go that well, I mean, Tony's wife was so pleased. I mean, he really, not only did he remember the words, I mean, he was in charge of the show. And, my favorite sound from all that was when Lady Gaga said that she was the last person. She asked Tony Bennett, "May I accompany you off the stage?" And that's going to be the last time anybody does that. I just thought, because they are close. She's a fierce young Italian girl from New York who is fiercely in love with her San Francisco Italian grandfather. And that's real. So yeah, couldn't have been prouder of Anderson's story.
Yeah, it was really beautiful. All right, well, I'll have another question for you about the impact of 60 Minutes at the end of this, but we have one more panelist. Eve Kay is representing the producing team of Stanley Tucci, Searching for Italy. In this, the first season of the series, we follow Stanley Tucci as he returns to Italy of his childhood to search for food and culture that make Italy so special. And this show came during COVID, which for those of us who hadn't had a chance to travel, it was so great to be in Italy with Stanley Tucci. How did this series come about? Did Stanley like knock on your door and say, hey, I have an idea for a show? I mean, was someone at a cocktail party? Where did this come from?
Thanks, Jonathan. The idea came from Stanley himself, who went to CNN Direct and said, I want to make a show about Italy and Italian food. And from there, CNN organized what's known as a beauty contest, and Raw took part in the beauty contest. And very fortunately, we were gifted the series. I can't speak for Stanley, but I think that if you read his autobiography, Taste, which was published recently, in there he talks about his very frightening illness, his cancer, and you get the impression that he faced his own mortality and had to think about what was important to him. And what was important to him was his family, where he came from, Italy, and the food that's nourished all of that.
So how did you go about developing the show? Did you do a pilot? Like, what was the process?
Well, we felt that it was really important to hire Italians and to have a UK team and have that sort of that local talent based in Europe, but also have Italians who could access the best stories and get those stories that aren't always front and center, to get behind the obvious, and also really importantly to build up the trust that you need to get people's real feelings and real passion. So I think that that was key in finding the range of stories that we have in every show.
You also have, obviously, Anthony Bourdain. His travel series, is hanging up there, and it's sort of gutsy to come in there with a new show. But it seems like you succeeded at creating something that feels unique in itself.
Well, yeah, Bourdain was a very high benchmark, and we tried not to worry too much about that, and we just tried to find a way of doing the stories that really lived up to the love that Stanley has for Italy. And in many ways, Stanley was sometimes quite shy of putting himself front and center. And so even though he's an incredibly witty, funny, charismatic guy, as an actor, he was also strangely self-conscious about performing himself. And what that meant was that it was never about him. It was always about those contributors. It was always about those dishes. It was always about the specificity of the region. And it was always about the glory of Italy and how wonderful she is as a country. And that I think more than anything helped drive the tone of the show, and hopefully gave it the sort of the authenticity that we were trying to represent.
Again, this was sort of your pilot season, and if I'm correct, I think maybe you were interrupted by COVID after shooting maybe the first episode. Is that correct?
We shot 4 episodes pre-pandemic, and then right at the end of editing those, COVID happened, and we watched in horror as the country that we had just been filming in went into the second lockdown, and saw the bodies and the morgues and ambulances and then people singing from arias from their balconies. And so in the late summer of 2020, that first year, CNN asked us to make 2 more. And so we went back partly in trepidation, but also, very excited, not quite knowing how it would be, having sort of seen Italy on her knees. And it was very difficult to as other people have described, we are on location during COVID. This is pre-vaccine. This is pre-testing. There was no way to test publicly or privately. We had protocols. It was extremely hot. People wearing masks all the time, social distancing. All the things that are now very, very familiar, but back then on location in Italy, of all countries, were very difficult. And at the same time, trying to show the love of the food and the people and the place on screen, it was quite a difficult balancing act.
You seem to, from looking at the first episodes to those later episodes, you hit your stride pretty quickly in terms of what the show would be. It didn't feel like you had to make any course corrections, or did you?
We had the opportunity to edit those first 4 shows. And so that was a moment where we could really figure out what worked and what didn't work. And so that meant that when we did go back in September of 2020 to do the last 2 shows, it was much more confident, and probably took less time to get the stories and get them really where we needed them to be.
Can you give me an example of something you learned through the editing process of those first 4 shows that you could then implement?
That you need about 3 times more cutaways than you think you do. But also the super importance of not just showing, the sort of Tucci, but also Italians. What are Italians doing? What are Italians eating? What are people in this city eating? What kind of pasta? Not just seeing the people in our bubble eating it, but more broadly, to really portray a place, in that moment. And it sounds really obvious, but oftentimes when you're shooting general views and cutaways, you're shooting them in a sort of impressionistic way, rather than in a concrete, specific way. And so not just shooting people as props, but trying to always tell the story in a person's face, even if we're never going to know their name. And all those little details adding to the feeling and the sense of place and the importance of that place and the importance of those people.
Wow, well, thank you. When can we expect to see season 2 of the series? I understand there's some challenges of being on a news network that has a big story right now.
Yes, there's a war on, and it's put the launch of the second season slightly. It's not clear to us yet when it's going to air, but hopefully we will be bringing more joy to your screens soon.
I hope so. All right. I'd like to bring all the panelists back now and ask you about sort of the impact you hope your show, your work has. Amy, what are you hoping is the larger impact of Alan versus Farrow?
Well, first, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here and to be speaking with all these incredible colleagues whose work I so admire, and I'm learned so much from just being on the panel. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. And in terms of impact, I mean, I also want to say to anyone watching this, I mean, we're in an industry that has tremendous, tremendous impact. I mean, Joan Didion in the White Album, her first sentence was, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And that always haunted me. I read that as a child and I thought, we are each other's stories, and narrative has a huge, huge place in all of our lives. It's kind of how we make sense of our lives, through the narratives we tell ourselves about our day-to-day existence, or for the narratives we inhale in the media constantly, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So we're ground zero for impact. And with that fact comes a great deal of responsibility. So So I think, you know, there's nothing that's more important than what all of us do, and we need to do it with integrity and care and that sense of responsibility. And I'm just, in terms of Alan v. Farrow, what we saw was, you know, the immediate impact was that RAIN, the organization that is sort of the I can't remember what the acronym stands for Rape and Incest National Network. It saw an uptick of 20% in phone calls every Sunday night that an episode premiered, which they said was astonishing. So talk about instant impact. I mean, on a micro level, you know, the letters we received from survivors of incest around the world were incredible. Family courts, many lawyers and prosecutors reached out to us and said they're going to use the series as a teaching tool because it's revelatory. For all of you watching, more often than not, I'm bad with statistics, I'd say over 90% of the time, children who are abused get sent back to the abusing parent because of false narratives that we all believe, that, you know, mothers lie, that you can plant false memories, that children aren't reliable witnesses, which all have no statistical proof backing or evidence to it. But that's kind of what our courts have been fed, you know, by incredibly, you know, well-rehearsed defense lawyers for decades. And it's influenced children being, unfortunately, you know, unfairly prejudiced by this bias and sent more often than not back to their abusers. So Alan v. Farrow, they're saying, is really going to help, they hope, enlighten judges, enlighten jurors, and, you know, help hopefully change how family courts work. So that's incredible. And then on just a, you know, a crazy personal level, I got a phone call like the second week from a friend, and, you know, and she said, "Amy, you know, congratulations on the series. I watched the first episode 4 times in a row, back to back." And I was like, I was about to say her name. "Why?" Like, "That's nice of you, but why?" And she said, "Oh, I never told you. This was my story." And she's my age. "And I've never told anyone. And it's the first time it helped me make sense of my life to see someone else like that out there." And so she said, "So thank you," you know, and I showed it to my daughter and she understood me now. So again, what I said earlier about Joan Didion, I mean, we are each other's stories. We do tell each other. So we use stories to figure out how we're living. And I'm just so happy that, you know, this work is out there and it's helping others, you know, make sense of their lives and helping others make sense of this kind of crime and be able to interpret it better and respond to it better in the future. So.
Well, thank you, Amy. Peter Jackson, what do you think the contribution the documentary The Beatles Get Back makes to our understanding of the history of the Beatles?
Well, I was very much aware that I'm dealing with 4 guys that are sort of icons now, you know, they're iconic. But of course, the trouble with somebody being iconic is that it simplifies their personalities down to sort of cliches. I mean, I think a lot of the Beatles, a lot of people would think of the Beatles as they were portrayed in their movie A Hard Day's Night, which was, in a way, they were sort of caricaturing themselves. But it's, you know, there was so little footage shot during the 1960s that shows the personal side of the Beatles. There's, you know, I mean, there's Hard Day's Night and Help, and there's Shea Stadium and Ed Sullivan. There's press conferences, but even in a press conference, they're on performance mode the whole time, really. And so I was just aware this was an opportunity to actually show the human side. these four guys. Now, we live in a world where whenever somebody says we're going to show the human side, you go, oh no, this is going to be bad. You know, it's almost like code for this is going to be pretty rough. And so I was very happy looking through all the footage that the human side of the Beatles was absolutely fine. They came out to me and as four decent guys. I mean, all with different personalities, different intentions, different dreams and desires. But, you know, I was determined not to take a side because, again, as celebrities, they tend to be pitted against each other. It's John versus Paul or George versus Paul. You know, people just tend to take them as their simplistic celebrity self and create conflicts, and they've had 50 years of that since they broke up. And so I just thought, well, this is an opportunity to show that these were actually four decent guys who were not, I was going to say, you know, you can say they're four normal guys, but of course they're not really normal because there's a genius there that very few people possess, a genius for song and music. And so it was showing the genius, but showing it coming out of being born from just human relationships with each other, and not judging. You know, it wasn't a documentary where I set out to judge anybody. It was just simply just showing it as it was, as best as I could.
Well, thank you. It was remarkable, just remarkable. Bill Owens, when you look at the lack of freedom of the press in Russia, China, how does it make you feel about 60 Minutes and, you know, its ability to do its role in the US and the world?
It actually makes me wish that I could be both in Russia and China. Those are two of the hardest places for us to work. And those are the two, in my opinion, and I think a lot of really smart people, not just within the American government, but all over the world, those are the places that are going to have the biggest effect on ourselves and our families over the next, you know, at least the next generation. So I would like to be reporting more from those two places. You know, right now we have people in Ukraine. Obviously, that's a very difficult place to operate. You know, I've covered wars before, but this war is like the wars that our parents fought in. This is very different than most everything else we've seen. And I know that's not an original thought, but I mean, even Sarajevo and Kosovo, those were brutal. But the scope of this, the size of this, it's Russia, has really, it's difficult even for us. And we've done this a lot to figure out how to cover it and keep the people who are covering it as safe as they can be. So I'm very proud to work at 60 Minutes. I'm proud of my colleagues who, you know, are up and feeling, you know, the bombardment alongside the people in Ukraine. But it's also, it's a bit of a dark time, I think. And as I look forward, I think we have our work cut out for us. It's going to be some dark days ahead, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks to all the journalists who risked their lives to tell these important stories. David Collins, what kind of impact do you hope Queer Eye is having on viewers? You know, as a country, sometimes it seems we take one step forward, we take two steps back. I'm thinking of, you know, what's going on in Texas and in Florida with some of the new laws they're passing. Do you hope that Queer Eye somehow breaks through to people and makes them think differently?
We hope, right? 20 years ago when, you know, back in the day, my business partner, my domestic partner / husband at the time, and I created Queer Eye together in the South End of Boston. We were just two young couple together. And I don't think we had even a clue of what was about to happen when Queer Eye launched on Bravo back in 2004. The reality came quick. This was pre-text and pre all that, but we did get emails, we got letters, and letters started coming, and hundreds of thousands of letters came back in the day. And those letters, without being overdramatic, were just mind-blowing. They were heart-wrenching stories that were just unbelievable. But then there was this unbelievable sense of hope where I got to sit in the living room with my parents, and because they saw the Fab Five being comfortable and okay, I was able to be confident and share my story. And so there was a lot of coming out stories back in 2004 where young people felt comfortable with their families to share who they really were and what they were thinking. And flash forward to 2022, Michael and I are now business partners, but co-parents of twin 13-year-olds. And so the impact really for me and for Michael is about our daughters. It's about the reality of the world they live in, and that the idea of coming out to them doesn't make sense. What do you mean coming out? I don't need to come out. I am who I am. And or the idea that trans, the LGBTQIA of it all is really nothing to them. They just simply are who they are. Queer Eye still today, the letters, the Fab Five themselves, the people that reach out to me from LinkedIn or Facebook and that just hit me out of the blue to just say, wow, getting to sit here and realize that I too am seen and validated for who I am. That's impact's pretty important, especially because on our partners at Netflix, it's global, right? So it goes 180 plus countries around the world. And those stories where a lot of the other countries don't get to live like we do, they don't have the freedoms that we do. There's hope in what Queer Eye represents, and that these five guys just share their own stories, and through sharing and being vulnerable, we get to hopefully open the door for our children to feel safe and comfortable in the next phase of their lives.
Here. Well, thank you, David. Eve, I mean, Stanley Tucci, Searching for Italy. You're not taking on huge issues, but I don't know, to me, it reminds us all of that there's so many interesting worlds and cultures out there, that this is all a connected world. What do you think about when you think about the potential impact of your show?
Well, on a micro level, I think that improving your cooking skills is going to make the world a better place, one meal at a time. And certainly in my own home, I try and nail pasta alla norma at least once a week and put a smile on my kids' faces. I mean, one of the things that I hope comes across in the show is that in the unlikeliest places where you have great poverty, and beautiful things can happen around meal times and around the table. And that, that's one of the stories that keeps coming through in every region that we visit. The people who have the least, their ingenuity, their creativity, their persistence, their hard work, shines through in these dishes. And I think there's incredible poetry there. And at a time when the world is a difficult place, to be reminded that there are beautiful things happening, is important, not to forget that.
I agree. Well, thank you, Amy, Peter, Bill, Eve, David, for joining us today. Getting to talk with you has been just such a pleasure. I encourage all our PGA members to see your nominated work. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. These are great questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
See you at the PGA.
Thank you.
Honor. Thanks, everyone.
Nice to see everybody.
Good day.